Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. This is a hearing for the Regulatory Affairs and Federal Management Subcommittee titled Modernizing the Federal Telework, Moving Forward Using Lessons Learned During the COVID-19 Pandemic. We should at least have something good come out of this pandemic. This hearing is really focused on what we can gain, what has already been learned, what gaps are still there, and what we can do to better improve the process. It's been a decade since the last significant piece of federal telework legislation, the Telework Enhancement Act of 2010. It set the baseline standard for federal agencies to follow for telework. But over the last 10 years, we've seen great advances in technology, workforce expectations, and an increase in cybersecurity threats. So many changes in the world, it makes sense to take a close look at the current telework policies and strategies within the federal workforce. The current pandemic has acted as a magnifying glass for telework policy improvement. This committee held a hearing in July with a panel of private industry witnesses. During that hearing, we were able to gather valuable information concerning what private employers have done to support their remote workforce. We're also able to draw out some lessons learned that could help the federal workforce recalibrate its telework strategies and policies. During that hearing, we also gained some insight into what the current private workforce is demanding. This, coupled with all the environmental challenges we now face, may help us create remote work policies that keep the federal government competitive in the hiring of highly qualified individuals. Since early March, federal agencies have been forced to deal with complex problems like cybersecurity, remote performance management, and employee engagement on a massive scale. The pandemic has been extremely disruptive to all of our lives, and I'm hopeful we can use these challenging times to shine a light on telework processes and find long-term solutions that provide real value for federal agencies and their employees. As I stated in the first hearing, there are some very important telework questions that I believe need clarity on in order for us to chart a clear path forward for the federal workforce. For example, how do we best prepare employees so that during a future disaster or pandemic, they can seamlessly transition into a federal workforce policy? How do we effectively train managers to stay engaged and to monitor performance of remote workers? What tasks could be permanently telework, which would open up opportunities to hire anyone, anywhere in the country? I want to make sure that cybersecurity threats and IT infrastructure improvements are at the forefront of future telework legislation conversations. Today, I look forward to hearing from the front line. We've heard anecdotal evidence of agencies overcoming the challenges of a mostly remote workforce. But today we have the opportunity to hear from the source. My hope is we can take what we learned in today's hearing, use it to create a more efficient, flexible, and competitive federal workforce. I do want to thank this panel for taking the time away from their very busy schedules. You've all done written statements in advance, and you've been a part of this for your oral testimony as well. We really appreciate the opportunity to be able to pick your brain, to be able to hear about what the agencies have done, what experience that you have gained in the process. For anyone watching this hearing, this is what we're affectionately calling a hybrid hearing. We have some individuals that are here in the room, though it's very, very few. 4 of our witnesses that will testify in this hearing. 2 of them are live, 2 of them are remote. Most of the individuals that are here will be remote for this hearing, and everyone is very well spaced during this hearing as well to be able to make sure that we maintain social distancing in the time period. So we're being attentive to all of those basic elements through this. But I do want us to be able to get this information out. It's important that we get it on the record as well. With that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Sinema for opening remarks, and she is joining us remotely. Let me ask a few questions, and until Senator Rosen is able to join us remotely as well. Ms. Rosenberg, you've been left out in this conversation. I don't want you to feel left out on it, but I do want to be able to zero in on some of the things that GAO has established. Obviously, GAO has looked at this issue of telework for a long time. You've submitted to us some of the things that you've done in the study, but there's one statement that stuck out to me on it. In the statement from GAO, you said this about performance management. Agencies should also establish guidelines to minimize adverse impacts that telework can have on non-teleworkers. So provide some clarity for us on agencies should establish guidelines to minimize adverse impacts that telework can have on non-teleworkers. What did you mean by that?
Thank you, Senator. We don't want to have create disagreements between those who can telework and those who cannot. For example, by forcing those who are in the office to take up responsibilities of those that are teleworking, whether that means physically moving documents or doing work that can't be done remotely. And so you want to make sure that if there are times that someone who is not teleworking needs to stand in for someone who is, that there is equity in that, and so that responsibilities are shared across both those who telework and those who don't.
So let me provide a little color to this and how I ask you this question. Several years ago, I was visiting one of our agencies, and I'll leave the agency out as I do this. But I was visiting one of our agencies, and it happened to be on a Friday. I was just walking around through the cubicle farm in that particular entity and just talking to different employees there. How's it going? How's the morale? Anything I need to be able to learn and be able to help with? And in the dialogue, I heard repetitively, "It's Friday, so half of our people aren't here. They're quote unquote teleworking today, but I know they're just not working today." And they were angry just about every cubicle I went to. I'm working hard. They took the day off, but they say they're quote unquote teleworking. When I read that statement from you from GAO, I thought I personally heard that, where individuals felt like they were carrying the burden. Now, in the last several months, just about everybody across the federal workforce has been teleworking. There's not been an option here back and forth. But in the days ahead, we all look forward to the time we have a vaccine and we do have that option again. What would you recommend here? Because what I was picking up from people that were not teleworking was a sense that the people that were teleworking were not being held to account, that the same metrics weren't being used for them for productivity as it was for those who were actually in the office for productivity.
Thank you for that. You know, one of the key practices that we emphasize is that the performance appraisal system and performance management needs to treat teleworkers and non-teleworkers the same. They need to be rated on the same competencies and judged accordingly. I think one of the issues is that telework requires a different way of managing staff. As opposed to managing by observation, you need to manage by results. We would also suggest that someone that you have a performance issue with, you are likely to have that performance issue with them regardless of whether they are teleworking or in the office. And finally, if there are concerns that someone that you cannot observe is not working, I would argue that that is not a telework issue, but that is a trust issue. And again, that goes back to that holding staff accountable for the results and the timeframes and the work products that they are supposed to produce, regardless of where they're working.
Okay, thank you. Sure, I was going to ask you a similar question on that. At the Department of Labor, are your managers able to hold teleworkers to account, to be able to check in on them, evaluate, to be able to have metrics performances? This is not new to the Department of Labor. You've done telework for a very long time, and you have a lot of workers that telework some days and are in office some days. What authorities does your management have, or I should say the opposite, what boundaries do they have in their management capabilities in the office versus in telework situation?
Thank you, Senator Lankford. We've worked very hard with our managers and supervisors to make sure they feel equipped and supported to manage in a virtual environment. As you've acknowledged, it's different to supervise someone remotely than it is someone that you can see physically throughout the workday and check in on periodically. We've been able to leverage technology to replicate as much of a real life experience as possible, just as we're doing today with a partially virtual hearing. We find that works very well. Our performance management system for years at DOL has been metrics-based, and we really work hard to make sure that all employees' performance plans are linked to departmental and agency operating plans and contain quantifiable measures. I'm delighted to report that we've just completed our 2020 performance year and have noticed no appreciable decrease in productivity or achievement against those operating plan metrics the whole time we've been teleworking. It also is interesting to note, and I think this goes back a little bit to perception versus reality, not a day goes by that I don't have managers and supervisors tell me how amazed and delighted they are at how well 99% telework is working. And I always ask, well, what did you expect? And they stop and say, well, gee, I don't know, but I'm just really surprised and happy that it is going so well. So the training, the support, and the performance elements that we're holding employees to seem to be working.
Okay. Mr. Borland, I want to loop you into this conversation with Ms. Rose as well. Both of you deal with a lot of private information, more so than many other entities do. Obviously, every agency does some, but you deal with a lot for both of your entities. Not only from your employees dealing with that on a laptop that's now in a home environment rather than in a more controlled office environment. There's PII issues that are there. But there's also, as we've mentioned already, that Senator Carper and Senator Sinema brought up, there are individuals trying to get access to you. I would tell you, Mr. Borland, I had the same calls into my constituent services and caseworkers. Those calls have come in saying, I'm trying to get a Social Security card replaced and I can't get anyone there. And we have an extra hurdle in Oklahoma that we're still trying to be able to get all of our real ID stuff all worked out. And it's made it much more complicated, and physically putting documents in the mail and mailing them to you has been a challenge. For Department of Labor, I've had individuals that have contacted me that said, we love the flexibility that we have because we have employees that we've hired remotely and we're not having to physically handle their documents this year. We're given authority to be able to virtually look at their license, virtually look at their birth certificate for an I-9. And their statement is, how do we keep that? So there's really two sides of this. The dialogue both for the customer, for our taxpayers to say, how can they continue to get that kind of flexibility? And for the agency, how can they continue to be able to maintain private information as private and secure? So Mr. Borland, you're an IT genius in this conversation. I'm gonna let you take off on this first.
So thank you, Senator. Certainly we do hold as custodians some very, very private information of the American public and very valuable information. And while telework is not new for us, technology does give us opportunities to ensure the continued protection of that information. First, I think we were one of the first agencies to implement a two-factor authentication for our employees and our contractors, so we have logical and physical access through our personal identity verification cards. Our network monitoring is similar to, but not the same as, pre-pandemic. And when I say that, when you take a workforce that is connected to the wall and immediately swing it to connected to the internet, there are some specific challenges there. We were able to pivot and change the way we do things like scanning for vulnerabilities and remediating them. We also look at from a program integrity standpoint. We have a long-standing process for monitoring transactions that take place within our systems to make sure that no one, employees or the public, are misusing the access to the systems that they have. Our employees, again, our information security policy is very clear. We do not allow bring your own device. Employees are not allowed to print at home. We've done extensive telework training and cybersecurity training for our remote workforce. And we think that has probably improved our security posture, although we do certainly have some unique challenges in being remote.
Any thoughts that you have for the end user, for the taxpayer themselves, and their use of digital items to be able to submit? Are there statutory limitations of that, or is it just technology limitations?
So there are some limitations, some statutory, some regulatory, but technology can overcome some of those challenges. As I mentioned in my response to Senator Sinema's question, we are looking at how we can use data exchanges to verify identity documents so that they do not have to be physically produced.
Ms. Rose, do you want to make a comment on this as far as protecting private information and then also giving the flexibility to individuals to be able to submit their information?
Yes, thank you, Senator Lankford. We have implemented many of these same security protocols that the Social Security Administration has in place. We're using PIV for multi-factor authentication. We do not permit sensitive data to be accessed on anything but government-provided DOL computers, and people must use RSA tokens to log into our network. So we feel that we have an environment, and we've worked closely with our colleagues in the Information Technology Office to make sure that environment stays safe and secure. We have onboarded over 1,000 people now virtually since the pandemic started, and we have gotten extremely positive feedback from all of the users, the people who are being onboarded, the supervisors and managers who are welcoming new employees in. A lot of people have commented on the facility and ease of the application and onboarding process because we have converted all of those paper-based forms and processes to the computer, and we've done away with wet signature everywhere we can. We're using digital signatures now. We provide the oath of office virtually, and we will probably continue that process with lessons learned beyond the pandemic. It has been so successful, and it has made face-to-face contact with people who are remotely duty stations much more effective and vibrant.
Okay, we're going to come back to that as well. Mr. Washington, I want to continue to press this, and actually I want to talk to all four of you on this one issue, and it's about hiring. It is a shift in perspective because many of the telework individuals are really people that are connected to the office, and they telework 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, but they're in the office, or maybe they're in the office once a month or whatever it may be, but there's a physical connection here. There's a paradigm shift in the conversation to say, we've now learned that we can not only telework 5 days a week, but we can do that month after month after month. And it begs the basic question, why couldn't you hire someone in Oklahoma to be able to do a task for an agency that's based in Washington, D.C.? What's the difference between Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona for actually bringing people on board? And the practical question is, there's not one. It also opens up a significant job opportunity to, let's say, spouses of our military, which often are working in very remote areas. By definition, a base or a post is very far from another area, and there are very few jobs available. But they could work at Department of Transportation in a telework situation, even if they're in beautiful, fabulous Altus, Oklahoma, where there aren't as many jobs available in that area because it's a remote training area. So that's whether you're Border Patrol and you're assigned to the northern border in North Dakota in a remote area and you're a spouse and you don't have many options, or whether you're a military spouse or whatever it may be, this opens up a lot of options for those spouses to be able to help those other federal families, not to mention a lot of other people that want to work in other areas. So I want to drill down and be as specific as you can. What would prohibit you, either in the regulatory space or the statutory requirements, or just in practical engagement, from not hiring people that you literally never plan to meet? Or if you do plan to meet, it may be an annual meeting at some point in the future. But you're talking about onboarding, supervising, working at a distance with no intention that they'll drive in once a week to be able to ever connect with the office on that. What would prohibit that? So, Mr. Washington, I do want to ask a couple more questions here. Ms. Rose, you talked before about onboarding, and there's lessons learned. Obviously, that's one of the challenges that we've all discussed. It's a very different dynamic, onboarding someone you've never met, your manager's not interacting with on a daily basis, and the challenge that you have typically when you land in the middle, as you and I both said, the cubicle farm, and you don't know how to fill out a certain form or to be able to do a certain process, you turn to the person next to you, and they kind of help you through that. You don't have that at this point when you're working remotely. You don't know the people that you work around. You don't know who else to be able to call on the team that's also doing the same job to be able to help you in the process. You don't even know your manager, and your manager doesn't know you. So what lessons have you learned at this point? And I'd be interested in any of the other of the three of you, if you've got specific ideas on this issue about onboarding, mentoring, helping people in the earliest days to be able to be a productive, valued part of a team, what lessons that you've learned in this? Because if we're going to start hiring people, no matter where they live, then we're going to have to take what we learned during this time period and to be able to accelerate that in a broader perspective. So anyone can answer that question. If you have additional insight, jump in, but I'd like Mr. Rose to go first.
Thank you, Senator Lankford. That is such an important point, and it is a vital lesson learned. We knew very early on that we would have to stay very engaged with our employees if we are not going to be physically co-located with them. We have provided training to managers and supervisors on how to manage and supervise in a virtual environment. And quite frankly, we have really leveraged information technology to every extent possible to try to replicate a real-time, face-to-face experience for our employees and for our supervisors. So we're using programs like Teams and Skype so that people can have conversations in person, digitally, and see one another, because that really makes a difference in getting to know someone. We've also tried to replicate some of our morale-boosting experiences in a virtual environment. We're going to launch our Secretary's Honor Award ceremony tomorrow, and it is going to be conducted completely virtually, but it'll be streamed out so that all of our employees can participate and send congratulations to their colleagues just as they would if we were having the ceremony in our auditorium. It takes a lot of effort and you have to rethink the way you do things, but technology has given us the ability to be almost as good as being there if we try and we use it.
Okay. So can I ask just a follow-up question
Sure.
on that as well? As you're gathering all this information and these ideas and you've got new training modules and everything else, are the Chicos sharing that with each other, or is every agency kind of developing their own structure, their own idea, because everyone's ramping up through this time period? How much collaboration is there agency to say, we found this module to be really good for training new employees, we found this to be really good for onboarding, we found this metric to be really good for measuring performance and evaluating this in a remote setting? So I'm just asking the question, is collaboration happening at this point at what level? I'm not expecting us to be perfect at this yet, because we're all trying to figure out, but has that started, and if so, what does it look like?
I'm pleased to report it has started. We have weekly Chico collaborative calls that all of the executive branch agencies participate in. We have not done as much sharing of lessons learned as I think we will coming out of this, because as you've acknowledged, we're still kind of in the thick of it. And we talk to each other on a case-by-case individual basis. We know each other. It's a small community, and the collaboration vehicle is there for us to make more use of it as we gain more experience and have time to share lessons learned.
Okay, that'd be very helpful. And if we can participate in that, we want to be able to help in that process. Senator Sinema and I are very, very engaged in this, along with the rest of our committee. What I don't want to have is a contractor pull together a really good training module and sell it to you, and sell it to you, and sell it to you, and to you. And suddenly the taxpayer's not getting good bang for the buck because one contractor created something that's really good and now they're selling it all over the place to everyone, when we could actually buy that license once and use it government-wide if we choose to on that. Okay, Mr. Washington, do you have anything to add to this?
The one additional thing I would add is that we have identified a sponsor for any new staff. I mean, even before they come aboard, so they can have that as a resource that they could reach out to. And the sharing of the best practices and the collaboration has really been integral to our success at the Department of Transportation. I mean, we have 54,000 employees all over the country. So when the pandemic hit, we started weekly meetings with our HR directors, and they were able to raise challenges and talked about best practices. And so that has been very integral to our success.
Okay, Mr. Borland, you have anything you want to add?
It's a technology solution that we found to be particularly helpful, but a pretty rudimentary one, and it's persistent chat rooms. In other words, giving folks kind of that water cooler place to check in during the day, to ask questions, to touch base. We found it to be very effective in keeping those connections that we're all used to from our physical workspace and perpetuating them. We also make widespread use of video teleconferencing, for meetings, I think many people have forgotten how to use their telephones because they're so used to just clicking on someone and calling them. So there's lots of great technology out there, but the important part of the use of the technology is the human aspect of it. It's that human connection. That's why we're moving towards video as well as audio to make that human connection. We've all been isolated a long time, and it's frankly really good to see my colleagues from time to time.
You know what? I can't begin to tell you the number of times I've heard in the last few months when I ran into someone in person at some spot that their first response is, "It's so nice to see a person." And so I get that. Ms. Rosenberg, anything that you want to be able to add to this as well?
I would certainly echo the sentiments that my colleague said. Maintaining that social connectedness and being creative in the way you do it is very important. I think the one thing I would add is that as part of this continuous communication is that employees' needs change over time. And so you need to adapt as the employees' needs are changing. I think we have certainly learned that as the pandemic has lasted longer than I think any of us had hoped, that we've had to adjust the types of resources we provide to staff and how we outreach to them as the situations that they're facing change.
I appreciate that very much. And you're right, this has lasted much longer than any of us had thought or hoped. I distinctly remember conversations in early March saying by Easter, and then we would fill in the blank after that. We didn't realize that was Easter 2021 when we were saying it. But it is just the reality of where we are today. I have about 9 hours more of questions for each of you, but you'll all be glad to know that there's a vote has been called, and so I'm not going to be able to do 9 hours more of questions with you, but I very much appreciate your insight. Let me ask one favor of all of you. As you work through this process, you're going to bump into regulations and to statutory prohibitions of things that you think this really needs to be done. This is the committee that will work on those things. So when you run into the statutory problems and issues or regulatory issues, would you please make sure you actually share them with us and not assume that Congress doesn't care to hear this. We do. We're just not doing the same thing you're doing all day, every day. We're not going to see it at the same level you are. So when you see those statutory barriers or you see a regulatory issue that needs to be addressed, please make sure you share it back with our committee. We're going to continue to be able to work on this because this is a paradigm shift for how we work as a federal government. We're opening up a much larger pool of individuals that are eligible to be able to work with us and with greater flexibility on some of the tasks that we have. We will always have in-person, and we should always be here in Washington, D.C. with our agency heads and all of those things to be able to interact for those face-to-face meetings that need to occur. But we have millions of people around the country that would love to be able to serve their country by serving in one of these agencies. And I'd love for them to be able to have the opportunity to be able to do that as well and to be able to compete, to end up on someone's list as the well-qualified candidate that happens to live in Altus, Oklahoma. And they get the opportunity to be able to compete for those tasks as well. So I look forward to ongoing dialogue about these issues, and please make sure that you continue to be able to keep that communication going with our team as we're pulling together different ideas. Senator Sinema and I have already started the conversation about legislation that may be needed or helpful in this process as well. But as you have ideas and your legislative team has ideas, please make sure those actually get shared with us on a timely basis. That concludes today's hearing. I am very grateful again for the witnesses that are here and for the time that you've been able to share with us, all four of you. Thank you for that. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until the close of business on Thursday, December the 3rd, which it's hard to believe 15 days from now we're into December, but we are. That will be for the submission of statements and questions for the record. Thank you again very much for your continued service as you've done for a very long time, and we look forward to getting a chance to be able to work together on this. This hearing is adjourned.